Welcome to my neighborhood. R, 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 R. The 4 R's, done in deference to the late Robin Williams when he was doing Mork Mindy so long ago, and tying into the discussion of how we imagine the world yesterday in the Dead Poets Society, is an important construct. The BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services defines the 4 R's as realization, recognition, response, and resisting. And what we're really talking about here is trauma-informed practice. And this doesn't have to just apply to mental health professionals. The mental health, BC Mental Health defines it as trauma is often closely tied to substance use, mental illness, stigma, healthcare access barriers, and other challenges. Trauma-informed practice means recognizing this link and making sure that people feel safe and are not re-traumatized by their care. This seems kind of obvious. I want to take it out of strictly a clinical practice and into a broader context today. The R's, realization, an organization-wide realization or understanding of how trauma affects people. Okay, first R. Second R, recognize. The ability to recognize signs of trauma. Okay. Response. A system-wide response to trauma that informs all behaviors, language, programs, and policies. And finally, and this is the one that we see a lot online in interactions, resisting the re-traumatizing patients, clients, and staff. Organizations can unintentionally create conditions that re-traumatize people. They can unintentionally create conditions that will re-traumatize people. Okay, so basic definitions in play. What does this mean? It's interesting because it applies to so many things. I mentioned that we see this a lot on the internet, and we do. We see people coming in and trolling and hijacking posts and things like that. You know, trolling is where they come in and they start fights, basically. Hijacking a post is where you glance at the post and then you put something else that you want to talk about in the comments, changing up the entire flow of what might have been an interesting conversation. But this is not quite so much power imbalance in that place, although sometimes there is. But if you start with a medical practice, very often there's a limited resource of expertise available. And they're the gatekeeper for care responses, whether it be housing or saving your life or providing you with prescriptions for things that are necessary to save your life. And you really don't want to piss those people off. I mean, quite a big power imbalance very often. So, if you make people aware of previous traumas caused by, simple things that you've seen again and again, and they go ahead and do it anyway, just using nice words while being passive aggressive or ignoring things, or not bothering to take the time or trouble to understand what the problem actually is and just trying to bury it with drugs, could fall into those categories. And I'm sad to say there's quite a few practitioners that do that. Well, everybody's out running today. I'm sorry for the background noise here. We've got a excavator working in the background here. But what about, that's doctors, hospitals, all manner of stuff. I mean, even little things. And I'm going to include some broader categories here than were in the original definition. Very often, we're seeing doctors go, "Oh, you're just getting old." This is quite a bad diagnosis in many ways. For one, no matter who you are, they're always right. Not because that's the source of the problem or your dilemma, but because everybody is getting older. The problem with it as a diagnosis is it makes the physician feel happy because they got it right, and it lets them ignore other underlying causes. I once had a situation where I went in and said, "Hey, I'm not doing so good and all this," and they said, "You're getting old." And I came back a month later and said the same thing, and they said, "Well, you're just getting old." I came back a month later in pretty rough shape, and he wasn't there, and somebody else was there. And he said, "Oh, you're being poisoned. I wonder by what?" And then I knew what to look for and discovered that my furnace had eroded and was in fact putting carbon monoxide into my house. If you come up with a diagnosis that makes you happy and satisfies the diagnostician's constraints, but doesn't, they stop looking. They stop asking the other questions. And yes, we're all getting older, but different people respond differently. Men respond differently than women to heart attacks, and as a result are often overlooked when they're having a heart attack. Most of the standard public criteria for heart attacks is for heart attacks in men. Likewise, a lot of drug testing, even the vaccines, was originally done with limited age-limited cohorts. They included older people, but they didn't include kids. So they're doing that now. And of course, medical practice is kind of a contradiction in terms because it's supposed to be evidence-based. But there's many kinds of evidence. There's, I did this in my practice, because I'm practicing, and it worked. And that's, a test case of one, or maybe more. And then there is randomized double-blind trials with thousands of people. But a lot of times, trials leave out people. In fact, they sometimes wash them out before the trial begins because it would be unethical to include them because they're having an unexpected reaction. And sometimes those don't get documented. 50% of the trials don't get published, privately funded ones, typically. They publish the ones that work. So we don't know about the other parts. So what happens when we traumatize people? I'm sure we have all had an experience with people in jobs or other kinds of positions of authority where they end up traumatizing other people on an ongoing basis. And there's really hard to deal with that. What we end up doing is often traumatizing ourselves as an adaptive response to the circumstances that we find ourselves in and the irreconcilable differences we run into along the way. When put in a position where you are supposed to be reporting on health and what's going on to your physician or specialist or caregiver or whatever, sometimes when people are traumatized, they will understate the situations that they're in. I mean, there's many different aspects, and I'm not a psychologist, so I've just seen this practice, just not a medical practice, just practice. The problem is sometimes that the person getting the reports of the statements think they're overstated and act accordingly. So what do you do? What happens when the entire globe is put in a new situation? Like a pandemic. Traditionally, historically, we have disasters that occur in relatively geographically constrained places. Before we had airplanes flying you all over the world, the plague traveled, but not quite so fast. And earthquakes happened, in Sicily, Iceland, New Zealand, Hawaii. Well, those are happening sort of sooner right now, but they're geographically local. This is different. I was listening to what was it? It was a Monocle program that aired, I know what it was. Monocle, the Entrepreneur. And it was aired on March 3rd, I believe, originally. And it was about ClearBanc. Now, the woman that started and runs ClearBanc also runs a venture fund, also by the name of Clear, and sits on the program Dragon's Den. But what she was saying was interesting because during this time and before, they have been doing database investing. That is, they really do their homework and they really do correlations and stuff. They don't just look at your credit rating to decide whether you deserve a loan for your startup. And the result is that the companies that they're funding, backing, loaning to, doing venture investments in, are doing very well. And also have a great deal more diversity in them than most other venture funds or most other banks. A lot more women, a lot more minorities of all sorts. Not that women are minorities. Trauma informed. You can be traumatized by just the way people treat you as many, many people know. If you are trying to get a book publisher, the number of rejections you get, even from agents, can be very high. And the same thing happens for people doing startups. Incubators help a little bit. They are usually funded by something, and sometimes they're self-funded as a percentage of the companies going out. And they have various other funding mechanisms and depths. But what they do is they connect you with a cohort of other like-minded people doing companies, startups, or facilitating transitions. For instance, right now we're looking at pretty major transitions in the publishing industry, in journalism. You know, we've got all this online stuff, and all the advertising is going to the big social media because it can be well targeted. And the newspapers and magazines are expensive to produce. I mean, just physically produce and send out and all that stuff, let alone all the research and writing and layout and everything else that has to go into them. It's changing. That's just one example. But how do we recognize trauma? And is it the right word even? I mean, yes, it's there. Yes, we want to recognize it. Yes, we want to resist re-traumatizing people. But these are all things, the recognition is positive. The resisting is pushing back. But it doesn't really say how to acknowledge people, how to balance power imbalances. The phone systems for registering for vaccines in BC have been cleaned up, evidently. It only takes a minute or two now to get through, or the recent reports. However, the media presentation is a little funny. They said today, well, we're going to open it up to people over 85. It's previously been 90, and Indigenous people that are over 65. But Vancouver Coastal Health, on their webpage, says anybody over 80 since March 8th can call if they live on the Sunshine Coast, Powell River, Pemberton, and Sea to Sky. But this is not being put out in the briefings, in the joint statements, or on CBC radio programming that hits those areas, for instance. So some people don't know. So we're trying to get the message out. If you're over 80 or 80 or turning 80, phone them. Make an appointment. Get the vaccine. If you're unsure about what I'm saying, look on the Vancouver Coastal Health vaccination pages or see the posting in Zoomers of the Sunshine Coast. The 4 R's: awareness, what does it take? What are the positive things we can do so that we don't knock people back. There is a term, and I don't know exactly where it comes from, but there's a thought of being present for somebody. And it's an interesting term because it doesn't say that you're going to be there and do one thing or another, but it says that you will be present. That means you're quietly paying attention to who they are and where they are. And without judgment, without looking at your phone, without being distracted, at least, the very least, for a moment or two. And this is one of the things that can happen strangely even when you're not with people. I think humans have an enormous capacity to be present. When you're present for somebody or with somebody, it helps. The 4 R's stop becoming an inane kind of laughter like Mork Mindy. Move a little bit more into the direct topical experience of literature from the Dead Poets Society. But most importantly, when you're present for somebody, you're present for you too. And it matters. It matters to you, and it matters to the person that you're being present with. So, maybe I'm not saying any of this very well. Not sure. Trauma-informed practice, to me, means being truly present. And all those 4 R's, still there. But they can't be practiced in a hospital, in a clinic, in any kind of consulting situation, in any kind of company, in any kind of family situation, anywhere, really, without being present. So, I'm very grateful for all the people in the world that are being present. I can see you. Hi. So, until tomorrow, bye now.